I'm Del Elliott, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here to the 4th Blueprints Conference. And we're just delighted to have each one of you here. It's a great privilege to see this kind of turnout and see this kind of interest in the Blueprints for Violence Prevention initiative, which is now going to be much broader than just violence prevention. It's my privilege to introduce to you Abel Ortiz. Abel is the director of the Evidence-Based Practice Group at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And the Annie E. Casey Foundation is now the official sponsor and supporter of Blueprints. And this has become a really strategic partnership for us. And it's allowed us, as a part of the Blueprints project, to really expand what we're doing in some very important ways. And we'll be talking about that later on. But help me welcome Abel Ortiz from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Abel?
Thank you. I am actually here to have the privilege to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, and I'm very, very excited about this. The speaker this morning is Bryan Samuels, who's the current commissioner of the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And we asked Bryan to come today because for those of you who have worked in the child welfare field or worked with a lot of federal agencies, you know that many times in these positions you get people that are policy wonks, that are very disconnected from the field. What we have in Bryan Samuels is somebody who has a passion for children and families. Somebody that has life experience that they bring that is of great value, and a person that understands not only that systems need to get good administrative data, they need to change children and families' lives for the better. And he has an understanding of what it's going to take to get there, and the importance of using proven programs and evidence-based programs to help public systems really reach our most vulnerable children and families. So it's exciting to have somebody at the head of the child welfare agencies in the United States that has that vision and that passion and that commitment. So we're really excited to have Bryan here. Bryan, before coming to this position, Bryan had a distinguished career in Illinois. He was the chief of staff for the school superintendent of Chicago Public Schools. He was also the director of the Department of Children and Families for the state of Illinois, which is their child welfare department. Bryan has a master's degree from the University of Chicago in public policy and a bachelor's degree from Notre Dame. And I am happy to welcome him to share with us his thoughts. So welcome, Bryan Samuels.
Good morning, everyone. Given that I am vertically challenged, I'm going to try to spend more time out here than behind the mic, but I may need to go back here every once in a while. So again, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. This is a really exciting time in the field of evidence-based practice, and this is a great audience for me to come and spend some time talking to, both because we've given a lot of thought to this work, but would also welcome the kinds of questions and conversations that you'll be having over the next couple of days to really even help accelerate our movement in this direction. Before I jump into my presentation, I also want to acknowledge Abel and the Casey Foundation's real commitment to this work around evidence-based practice. They've shown a good deal of leadership in this area, and we welcome the opportunity to work with Casey and with others to really continue to move the field forward. As Abel indicated, I'm the Commissioner for the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families. And so in that context, I am responsible for the federal programs around both child abuse prevention as well as child abuse and neglect interventions. So all of the child welfare work sits under me. And then on the other side of my responsibilities, we also oversee the programs related to the runaway and homeless youth population. So the funds that go to funding the basic shelter system, street outreach system, and transitional living for youth who are runaway and homeless. We also are responsible for overseeing about 50% of the federal resources related to domestic violence and intervening appropriately there. And lastly, we're responsible for about 150 million or so, $150 million or so in teen pregnancy prevention dollars. And so in many respects, when I talk to you today, I will be using references to child welfare. But in reality, the process that I'll walk you through and the thought process we've gone through, we think applies to a much broader audience than just the children in the child welfare system, and you'll see me construct that argument. And so in total, most days we're responsible for what could be considered the most vulnerable youth in America, and we think that evidence-based practice has a really critical role in getting to better outcomes for the most vulnerable populations in our society. And so you'll see that reflected in my comments. I'm going to try to get through my presentation in about 45 or 50 minutes so that it leaves us a half an hour to 20 minutes or so for a dialogue back and forth, both to answer questions as well as for you to share insights that you think are important for me to hear as well as important for others in the room to hear. So that's the way we're going to approach this. Obviously, I come as a political appointee from the Obama administration. I don't need to give you a political speech, but I think the one point that I think is really important is for everybody in the room to recognize that this is an administration that is very grounded in the literature, that's very grounded in the expectations of greater accountability for federal resources, and has put its money behind evidence-based practice. And so the president has stepped out over the last 3 years and worked with Congress, not against Congress, but worked with Congress to advance the home visiting funding. So as you know, that is a 5-year program to implement evidence-based home visiting services with about 25% of the money set aside for innovative practices. In addition to that, there was a real commitment to teen pregnancy prevention by focusing on evidence-based strategies for teen pregnancy prevention. And so across HHS, there's almost $300 million going into evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention. So if you take the two programs together and you look at them over a 5-year period of time, they represent well over $2 billion in investments in evidence-based practices or programs that are promising enough that we think with the right implementation focus and a rigorous evaluation could be elevated to a level of an evidence-based practice. So a good deal of work has gone on in this direction. And as you can imagine, in the context of that work being pushed forward, the administration has also been asking everybody else, so where's your evidence? And if you don't have evidence, then what are you doing to build evidence? And so that's why I say this is an important time, is because in the context of looking at limited federal resources and trying to get the best you can for the limited dollars we have, evidence-based practice has become a really critical component of that agenda. And I suspect that regardless of what parties win in November, the focus on evidence-based practice, I think, will remain, because I think overall folks recognize that there are going to be fewer federal dollars, not more federal dollars, invested in vulnerable populations. And in the context of those limited dollars, folks are going to want to be able to get more bang for their buck. And so great situation for folks that are really committed to this work moving forward going in the future. In addition to that, I think it's worth noting that the child welfare system has been pretty slow in moving to evidence-based practice. A typical response in a room of just child welfare folks would say, well, we don't have any evidence-based practices. We don't do that. That's not what we do. We're responsible for kids and families. We intervene for those families who need us the most, but we don't do evidence-based practice. And so I'll talk some about that. And if you're not comfortable with that answer, then they say, well, all right, there may be some evidence, but you can't expect us to pick and choose which population of kids ought to get those evidence-based things. So unless we can do it for everybody, then we probably shouldn't do it for anybody. Or they say, really tough economic times, not a lot of resources. We need to just hold on to what we have and try to control what we have so that we can make sure that we meet the basic expectations of children in foster care. So those are the three most common responses to a question about, so where's the evidence in child welfare? And I say that not with the sense that the child welfare system is trying to duck its responsibility to meet the needs of children and families. I think those three responses are genuine responses from the field. And so as the person at the federal level who's operating in an environment where the expectation is that you demonstrate evidence for the work that you do, we spent a good deal of time trying to figure out how to move the field of child welfare to a place where it can understand its level of evidence and can understand the role that evidence can play in the work that it does. And so the presentation that you'll see today is a presentation that has evolved over the last year and a half as we've both engaged the field of child welfare in a discussion about EBPs, but also engaged the scientific community around the importance of EBPs. And so that's what you'll see here today. It's also important to recognize that in child welfare, the primary focus over the last 15 years has been on reducing the size of the foster care population. So between 1988 and 1999, the child welfare system in this country doubled in size. In 95-96, Congress started conversations with the states about how to reduce the growth and the rate of growth within child welfare. The real concern was that at that rate of growth, it was unsustainable in the long term. There was also a fundamental belief that there were some children and families entering the foster care system that didn't need to. And so in 1997, they passed the Adoptions and Safe Families Act. And that just fundamentally shifted the perspective of child welfare. And it articulated three objectives: safety, permanency, and well-being. And for the last 15 years, we focused on safety and permanency with the hope of getting to well-being. And by any reasonable measure around safety, permanency, and well-being, we have had significant progress in safety and permanency. So today, the child welfare system is about 30% smaller than it was in '97. One of the great challenges in child welfare was that it was always disproportionately African American. So in 1997, there were about 240,000 African American children in the foster care system. Today, there's 120,000. So there's 50% reduction in African Americans in the system. Just this last year, the child welfare system produced 20,000 more adoptions than it did 10 years prior. And in just the last year, the child welfare system took into foster care 50,000 fewer kids than it did 5 years ago. So if you're looking for a measuring stick for is child welfare making progress, I think that data would support the child welfare system is making progress. Some of you will say, yeah, but what happened to those kids? Great question. We can come back to that one. The other question you'll ask, but are children at risk of harm? Are we exposing more children to harmful circumstances? And the basic measures that we use for that are the recurrence of maltreatment or reentry into foster care. And if you look at those rates over the last 15 years, they remain almost constant. So I can't tell you that children and families are any safer today. I think I can tell you they're no less safe today than they were 15 years ago. So by that yardstick, we've made some progress. And to the credit of every state in this country, they've really invested significant dollars in getting there. If you think about it this way, the federal government has two pots of money. One pot is called Title IV-B, and the other is Title IV-E, with Title IV-E being the biggest investment. But if you look at those investments relative to the states and counties, the federal government in 2008 or so, because that's the most recent data we have, in 2008, the federal government invested about $10 billion in foster care. Total spending on foster care was about $22 billion. So states and counties invested about $12 billion of the $22 billion. So states and counties are actually investing more in child welfare than is the federal government. So that's the context in which we're having a conversation about child welfare. They focus on getting dramatically smaller. They've developed their capacity to get smaller. They're in the context of a difficult situation economically, and now we come forward and say, well, you ought to be thinking about EBPs. And the logical question they ask is, how does an EBP get me to more safety or to get me smaller? And if you can't answer that question, then they go back to doing what they've been focused on. And so we really think that in order to get significant movement towards evidence-based practices in child welfare, we really do have to make a much stronger case than this is just a good idea. And so the presentation I'm going to go through now is my argument for why we need to do EBPs and how we're thinking about it.
Check, 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 check.
So in the context of the success that I described for you, the one place that almost everybody sees as the fundamental failure of the child welfare system is for those youth who are aging out of foster care. Everybody recognizes that as the population for which the child welfare system has failed, right? And folks just want to know, well, why can't you just fix it for those kids? Why can't you just get it right for those kids? And in part, I think that argument has been made and drilled into the minds of a lot of folks without the full context of appreciating what's going on there. So the first mystery or misnomer about the young people who age out of foster care is that they grew up in foster care. Not true. The average kid who ages out of foster care entered foster care at 14. I didn't say 4, I said 14. The average length of stay for a child who enters foster care at the age of 2, the average age for a child entering foster care at the age of 2, the average length of stay is 1 year and 7 months. The average length of stay for a teenager entering foster care is 7 months. So in theory, we actually are spending more time with younger children than we're spending with older children. But for those older children who we spend time with who don't exit in 7 months, this is typically the way their challenges are articulated, by looking at the challenges that they face from a social and emotional standpoint. So this is data of 17-year-olds in out-of-home care, and this is a population that almost 95% of them aged out of foster care at the age of 18. So this is what they look like just prior to exiting foster care. And so these are the 4 most common mental health diagnoses for kids in foster care overall. PTSD is the first one, attention deficit and ADHD, major depression, and conduct disorder. So those are the 4 most common mental health diagnoses. The difference between the green and the orange is the orange number tells you what percentage of these 17-year-olds had this diagnosis. So for PTSD, using the orange number, that says that 14% of this group of 17-year-olds had a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress. The number in the green is the percentage of children who had that diagnosis prior to entering foster care. So the second myth, we think, that almost everybody believes, including child welfare, is that the difficulties young people having across these kinds of issues are issues that were created by the foster care system. The quote from the folks at Harvard that have been looking at the impact of toxic stress on the development of children. And they come to a really fascinating conclusion, which is that children early in life exposed to lots of bad stuff can't be picked up and put in a nice place and just get better by themselves. This is also not an argument that is only related to kids in foster care. So this is a slide of young people who were entering public systems in San Diego. This is a 2011 article. And it compares children in child welfare, substance abuse treatment, mental health services, and juvenile justice system. And it looks at their exposure to maltreatment. So as you can see, if you just look at any maltreatment, very similar in the size of the impact of maltreatment. And if you look at the orange, which is more than one maltreatment type, very similar. So the argument I'm going to make today isn't simply related to kids in foster care, it's related to any kid who has experienced significant maltreatment in their lifetime. So what we know from the neuroscience is that brain development is significantly impacted by the environment, and that healthy brain development happens in the context of healthy relationships with caregivers. We also know from the brain science that heightened stress changes the way the brain is organized. That neuroplasticity argument, there's a lot of flexibility in the brain, and that depending on the environment in which a child is exposed to, that brain will shape and reshape itself to deal with that environment. But this second quote here goes to a really important aspect of abuse, because it talks about the executive function issues around brain development. And it talks about the fact that executive functioning is a cluster of skill sets that are around the making, planning, and altering plans. It's around controlling and focusing attention. It's about inhibiting impulsive behavior. It's around having a skill set and an ability to incorporate new information into decision making. Think about that slide or the stories you've heard about the struggles of kids who have aged out of the foster care system. I just described them. So again, this is just the brain science, and it's talking about how the systems develop in the brain, and that there's an alarm system in the brain that says when the body ought to be concerned about bad stuff happening to it. And when that alarm system goes off, there are a set of survival mechanisms that start early in life that really then enables that child to deal with the bad stuff that's coming at them. And the findings of lots of folks that have done this work in brain science and maltreatment is that those alarm systems get embedded in how a child develops physically and from the brain perspective. And so that's why when you pick them up from a really bad place and you put them in a really nice place, they don't just instantly get better. They don't instantly get better because their body, their brain and physical response system has been molded in the context of toxic stress. This is a slide from Illinois. It represents children entering foster care within the first 45 days. So this is a comprehensive assessment that I implemented in the state of Illinois in 2005. And so it looks at children who are entering foster care, and it looks at them within the first 45 days, and we do it for every kid, and we do it for their biological family, and we do it for their placement type. So this is looking at issues of mental health and trauma. And as you can see, if you start on the left and you move your way right, the younger children, that big slice of the column there is the number of children that are showing no symptoms of mental health problems or trauma symptoms. As you go up, you see about 11% of them, almost 12% of them are exhibiting trauma symptoms. About 7% are exhibiting mental health symptoms, and about 13% are exhibiting both trauma and mental health. As you can see, as you work your way across the spectrum here of ages, what you see is the number of young people showing no symptoms goes down. It's cut in half almost by each age group. The level of issues around mental health and trauma go up, but more importantly, the mix of trauma symptomatology and mental health symptomatology gets bigger and bigger. So when you look at the 17-year-olds who are entering care, and in Illinois they can stay until they're 21. If you look at those children entering foster care in the first 45 days, what you see is over 60% of them are exhibiting both mental health symptoms as well as trauma symptoms. This is the complexity that walks into foster care every day. And they walk in at each of these ages. So pick the 14-year-old category on this slide and ask yourself the question. If that child walked into the foster care system, what would we have to do in the 5 years I'm going to have with that 14-year-old, or the 6 years I'm going to have with that 14-year-old in Illinois, or the 7 years I'm going to have with that young person? What ought to happen for that person so that you can turn this set of issues around and moving in a positive direction? And then think about how many of you know of any system that's moved in a direction that they could do that for these kids. But if we want better outcomes for the aging out population, this is what we need to focus on. But here's the big takeaway. These problems aren't limited to the kids who age out of foster care. These are all kids entering foster care. So regardless of how they exit, we have to fix the system. Not just for the kids who age out. Regardless of whether they age out or not, this is how they show up. And changing the results for all of them is what the system ought to be organized around dealing with. So this is another slide of the complexities that come with child welfare. So these are different age groups. This is data that comes from the National Study of Well-Being. So it's NSCOT, National Study of Child and Adolescent Well-Being, and it looks at, by age groups, the percentage of children who are demonstrating a risk of social and emotional problems. That's the green bar. And the orange bar are the percentage of young people who are on psychotropic medications. So even though we have little to no evidence that psychotropics work for children, as you can see, even for the 1.5 to 5-year-old category, there are children being prescribed psychotropics. A much larger percentage of them are exhibiting risk of behavior problems. And that risk of behavior problems, said differently, is using the child behavior checklist. If a child is in the clinical range, they're considered at risk for this study. If you look at the 6 to 14-year-olds, what you see is almost 50% of them are exhibiting issues that are at a clinical level, and about 20% of them are being prescribed psychotropics. The number goes down slightly for the 11 to 17-year-olds. The average rate of psychotropic prescription in Medicaid is 2%. So all other poor kids compared to kids in foster care, 2% versus 20%, 2% versus 16%. This slide here is for all the folks that say, but it's the kids who we take away from their families that we ought to be most concerned about. So this slide here shows you children who weren't removed from their home. The in-home population is 90% of this sample. So it's probably more reliable than the rest of it, but we can have that debate another time. But as you can see, whether it's in-home, kinship, foster care, group homes, and residential, right? At least for the first three categories, these kids look almost exactly the same. So all of you that advocate, well, we just need to keep more kids out of the system and serve them out of the system. Okay, I'm with you. But that would mean serving them in the exact same way that the kids who are in the system need to be served, because they look exactly like them. So the notion that it's the out-of-home kids versus in-home kids that we ought to be thinking about, that notion is really challenged when you look at this data. Again, I came back to the most common mental health diagnosis for all of these kids. They're the exact same ones that were the most common diagnosis for the kids who are going to age out of foster care. Again, these are all kids. There's some folks in the room and a lot of folks in the child welfare system say, but yes, but if we can just find children permanent homes, things are better and they'll get better. And this is a slide that summarizes some studies out there that challenge that assumption. So the first one speaks to the issues of reunification. And so this was a study that was done by Bellamy back in 2008. And basically what Bellamy found was that children who went back home, who were reunified, their social and emotional issues actually went up the first 18 months. They didn't get better. From a clinical standpoint, they actually got worse. Some of them leveled off at 36 months. Very few of them actually went down. So they didn't even get back down to the baseline they were at when they exited foster care. Folks say, yeah, but if you put them in kinship care, that solves all the problems. Just put them with their kin, everything else is fine. The second study talks about the fact that if you look at the adult outcomes for children who spent all of their time in kinship care, more than 50% of their time in kinship care, less than 50% but some time, and no time. So when it looks across all of those groupings, all four categories, it found no statistical difference in social and emotional well-being for any of them. So kids who spent all of their time in kinship care versus none of their time in kinship care looked exactly the same. Adoption tells the same story. This is a study that looks at children 2 years after adoption, 4 years after adoption, 8 years after adoption. Things got worse between baseline and 2 years. They got worse between 2 years and 4 years. They leveled off at 8 years. They didn't get better at 8 years. So the argument here, guys, is that this is really about maltreatment. That the outcomes that we're looking at, that all of us will lose sleep about, is about maltreatment. And so regardless of where we serve them, the challenge is, how does child welfare build the capacity to anticipate the profile that I showed you earlier, to anticipate the profile of children entering foster care? How does it organize itself around addressing these issues? Because this is a challenge. If you want better outcomes for kids who are aging out of foster care, it requires the same strategy as getting better outcomes for 3-year-olds who enter foster care. Big focus in child welfare has been on life skills, preparing young people who age out of foster care for the bad stuff. So yes, we know the bad stuff happened. We can't do anything about that. So we're just going to focus on those pragmatic things, things that we know if we do and we get them right, kids will get better. They'll have better lives. So this is a series of 4 studies that were done looking at the Chafee program. Mark Courtney and a number of researchers almost 8 years ago spent a good deal of time looking at what they thought were the best programs that were organized around kids who were aging out of foster care. So they went to find 4 of the strongest ones they could find, and then they evaluated them for the purposes of seeing whether kids in foster care benefited from any of them. And so one looked at tutoring and mentoring, another one looked at a program that focused on life skills, a third is one that focused on employment, and a fourth that focused on intensive case management and mentoring. Best ones we could find. The column that says findings tells you what we found. We found, as it related to tutoring and mentoring, that there was no meaningful distinction between those who got served and those who didn't. We looked at life skills. Those who got them and those who didn't looked exactly the same. We looked at employment. Those who got them looked exactly the same as those who didn't. And there was a small population in the 4th study that did get better. And when they went back to look at what was the variable that explained that they got better, was that those kids stayed in foster care a little bit longer than the other ones did. But on the face of it, just turning and focusing on those soft skills, those things that we know are essential, everything else will at least be okay. Right? So that's the context of a conversation about EBPs. Right? For all of you who have spent a good chunk of your time trying to figure out how to do this work, the articulation for why this work is really important is that this is the set of challenges we have in foster care, and these are results that we're getting from the current set of strategies we have. So whether it's return home, kinship care, or adoption, challenges remain the same. Whether it's the aging out population and looking at mentoring, life skills, or other interventions, challenge is the same. This is a slide that talks about the impact of maltreatment on relationships and the ability of young people to engage in relationships that are positive and productive. And I'm sorry, I've given this presentation 50 million times. That's not the slide that this one is. It's a different slide. This is a slide that takes the ACEs study, the study that looked at adverse childhood experiences, and that found that the more adverse childhood experiences you had, the higher was your rate of stroke, the higher was the rate of cardiovascular disease, the higher rates of substance abuse you had, that there was a cumulative effect of these bad experiences in childhood on your results as adults. So this was a study done that was examining people who were on average 55 years old, and they were attaching adverse childhood experiences early in life to their adult outcomes. So that was a pretty powerful study. This is a study that tries to do the same thing, looking at young people who had spent some time in the foster care system, and it takes them, these are all women, this sample is all women, and it takes them and looks at, did they report, one act of violence as part of their entering foster care, 2 acts, or 3 or more acts. And then it looks at their mental health and well-being as adults. And as you can see, even if you take the second column, which is lifetime mental health diagnosis, at 1, almost 60% of them. At 2, almost 70% of them. At 3 or 4, almost 90% of them had a lifetime diagnosis of mental illness. So the challenge here is about maltreatment. And it's about taking a system that thinks its obligation is just safety and permanency, and trying to get it to know maltreatment when it sees it and does something about it. And we think the only way you get to that is to really focus on well-being. Because the other two outcomes, safety and permanency, do not require a child getting better off. It typically only requires that adults get better off. So we can give the kid back, or adults come to the conclusion that they're committed to this young person for a lifetime, and they exit the system. But it's only in that context of you want better child-level outcomes or family-level outcomes. It's only in that context, does it seem to me, that the system will deal with these issues. Because as long as the priority and focus is on safety and permanence, it doesn't require any improvement in child functioning. If improved functioning occurs, bonus, but it doesn't require a change in functioning, which is all of the issues I just spent the last 30 minutes or so arguing are there. And so we think that the real focus of child welfare ought to be on maltreatment. We think the data points that we showed you give you lots of consistent information to say that tomorrow, if there are 10 kids who enter the foster care system tomorrow in any place, you can today describe what they'll look like. There's really interesting literature around the impact of maltreatment on relationships. And this slide is just trying to communicate the cascading effect of maltreatment, how it ripples throughout a young person's life, how it stays with them for long periods of time, and how one of its fundamental impacts is on a child's capacity to engage in healthy relationships. And yet, almost all of life requires that you be able to establish healthy relationships with other human beings, whether it's at school, in the workplace, or in your private life. A big part of anybody's success is their ability to engage in healthy relationships. And so this is just trying to communicate that maltreatment, unaddressed, has a cascading effect on a child's ability to function, but ultimately on their ability to establish relationships. One of the really scary statistics for the aging out population, there's a Midwest study that was done that looked at Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois, kids who age out of the foster care system from there, and they have followed them longitudinally. So the last published wave was on young people who were 25 and 26. And it looked at all of their issues. And one of the ones that was profound, was their employment outcomes. At the time that they were interviewed at 25 and 26, only half of them had a job. But if you circle back around to the section of the study that shows their mental health issues, well over 50% of them had it. So there are some young people who came through that bad stuff and they didn't develop a mental health diagnosis. They probably had decent relational skills. They're employed. This is just a summary of the impact of maltreatment or trauma, whichever word you want to go with. This is what the scientific findings are. But we think if you want to think about moving children in a positive direction in achieving improved functioning, knowing that this is the imprint means really moving to a framework of well-being that focuses on cognitive functioning, physical health and developmental functioning, around emotional and behavioral functioning, and around social functioning. And so that's what the second row is trying to communicate. That if we wanted to think about from a developmental standpoint for each of the 4 categories of age, what would be kind of the key indicators that you would outline for a well-being strategy? We've tried to summarize it here. Hard to read for folks. You can get my slides at the end or during the conference. They'll put them on the website or whatever, but you can get this. So really what we're trying to do is to reframe child welfare in the context of a well-being framework, and the big focus is saying, and in order to get that right, we have to focus on the child's, not the system's outcome, but child-level functioning and family-level functioning. And the value of EBPs is that you're not focused on systems outcomes, you're focused on child and family-level improvements. And so we've got to create a frame that child welfare can put its arms around that says, no, we too have to care about child and family level outcomes, and by focusing on key domains of functioning, we can see progress over time. So you could imagine an SDQ, or you could imagine a child behavior checklist, or in Illinois, we imagined the child and adolescent needs and strengths assessment being done on every kid entering foster care. And then in Illinois, we did that same assessment every 6 months. And we did it if a child moved placements twice in 12 months. And we did it entry into a higher level of care and exiting a higher level of care. So we knew what domains of functioning children had. And we could compare apples to apples because we used the same instrument everywhere. And so we could say, how is Johnny doing? And we could talk about it in the context of an instrument that was used for everybody. And one of the things it allowed us to do was to look at the outcomes we were getting from our residential treatment programs. So we connected that functional assessment with outcomes after being in residential treatment. And what we could end up doing was to show residential treatment programs the profile of kids that did well after exiting their program, and the profile of kids who didn't do well. And we made a decision based on that we're going to send you these kids, but we're not going to send you these kids. This is kind of aspirational. It's an attempt to take all of the maltreatment data and the trauma data and to try to organize ultimately how we would measure success, how we would describe success. And so we've got 5 categories here that we think are really important, that young children or all children who exit foster care, we want the impact that we had on them while they were in foster care to be one, that they have a better understanding of relationship and they have the capacity to engage in healthy ones. If they don't have that, they miss a lot of what it takes to succeed. That they have effective verbal and nonverbal communication. And more importantly, they understand other people's verbal and nonverbal communication. That they have a much better understanding of self. Empathy is one of those really critical competencies that happens when you want to get someplace in life. Said differently, if you can't put yourself in your boss's shoes, then you can't anticipate what he's going to like and not like. But if I can understand from your perspective how the world works, then I can turn back around and try to give that back to you. But if I don't have the capacity to see the world from your eyes, I don't have the ability to adjust and compensate or anticipate what you need from me in order to succeed. So we ought to try to we articulate this issue around understanding the world and about adaptations and resilience. We think in a lot of ways by focusing on functioning, we're not attempting to cure anybody. But we're trying to say, in the absence of having a set of skills, or in the context of having a set of impairments that don't allow you to take the traditional path to good outcomes, we want to help you develop a different set of skills that allow you to get there anyway. And so we think that's about really rethinking the way we choose services, moving from a focus on ineffective services to one on effective. Again, if I can't get the state child welfare agency to recognize that what we really care about is a movement in the individual child's ability to function, then it doesn't matter which service I provide them. I can give them service as usual, or I can give them an EBP. You've tried to have that conversation with folks. Yeah, but you'll get much better outcomes here. And they say, but I already got a service over there. Right? And that service allows them to say that we identified a need and we gave them a service. I've done my job. But you're sitting over there saying, but no, you get a much better outcome if you use an EBP. And they say, well, but I've met my outcome. I've met my obligation when I've provided them a service. And we're saying, nobody would argue, right, that the service doesn't matter. But the reason why the service matters is because you want to see improvements at the child and family level. And as long as we focus on safety and permanency, we think, those being systems level outcomes, we can disregard the child level outcomes. And if we disregard the child level outcomes, we disregard your argument for an EBP. And so we have worked closely with SAMHSA. We work closely with CMS, which is the Medicaid federal agency. We work closely with others to really think about what are the set of evidence-based practices around the most common mental health diagnosis, as well as looking at what the right screening tools are that would allow us to look at functioning over time and be able to promote improved well-being by knowing where a child is at baseline and choosing interventions that have the greatest likelihood of moving them to a different place. So if you took a traditional mental health approach, you might focus on these interventions. If you said, no, we think the real issues are not mental health in the classical sense, but we think that these mental health diagnoses that are listed here are really misdiagnoses. And the real diagnosis for these kids is complex trauma or interpersonal trauma or developmental trauma. And if that's the argument that you make, then you probably focus on this set of evidence-based practices. And again, we weren't trying to be all-inclusive, but we were trying to establish an evidence base for what you do if you're committed to or you see the necessity for focusing on child and family level functioning. So again, understanding and anticipating the impact of maltreatment we think is really critical. Understanding why it happens and the developmental consequences of it is really important. And we think we ought to be building systems to move in that direction. And so I'm going to stop by talking you through this list. Because in part I've given you a bunch of clinical data that you're not quite sure what to do with. And in part I've given you a really interesting argument, but you're not quite sure what to do with. And so this here is a set of concrete examples of where we're going to try to move child welfare using evidence-based practices as a central component of that strategy. So the first one here is flexible funding waivers. So Congress has given HHS the authority to waive any of the funding requirements that are under Title IV-E. So that big chunk of money that I said the federal government spends is mostly in Title IV-E. We now can give states flexibility about how they use that money. So if a state said I could actually serve a child better in the home than taking them out of the home to serve them, then the waiver authority allows us to say, you can take money over here, but serve a kid over here. And what we're going to say to all the states that want that is, we want you to serve kids here, and we want you to serve kids here in equally effective ways. So we're indifferent to where you choose to serve a child. We're not indifferent to where you focus your energy in how you serve that child. And we're going to express a clear and compelling argument and expectation that where the system needs to go is focusing at the child and family level improvements, and challenge states to really think about What level of evidence do they have for their existing set of programs to improve that level of outcomes? And what other programs and strategies they need to move children at that child and family level of functioning, regardless of where they choose to serve them. And so we'll try to frame that out and articulate it and work with states to support them in every way possible. The waivers are also going to provide an opportunity for states to bring Medicaid to the table, because we've partnered with Medicaid and SAMHSA. So our announcement will articulate a partnership between us and SAMHSA and Medicaid, and talking about how you use all three of those federal entities to create a foster care system that is more reflective of the system that I described just a moment ago than the current system is. So again, we can't impose that on states. This is totally voluntary, but we think it's the logical place for the system to go. Waivers were intended to promote innovation and to demonstrate promising ideas. And so we're going to try to push states in that direction using the waivers as a carrot. Not a stick, but a carrot. If you want the flexibility of spending the federal dollars differently, then make a commitment to improving child and family functioning in the context of asking for that money. The second example are a set of discretionary grants that we're doing. So on the trauma and mental health side, we did grants last year. We'll make more grants this year that focus on using validated screening mechanisms, screening instruments, assessment instruments, and then aligning treatment to those instruments. And so, again, that's discretionary dollars. It's a carrot. States can choose to pursue that money or not. But if you want the money, we don't want you just to care about safety and permanency. We want to know how this money helps a child get to well-being. We've made investments in educational stability. So last year we gave 8 states funding to work with their school system to better coordinate, because education is a critical domain for well-being in this population. And we also made 8 grants to states and early education systems to work better together so that more kids were enrolled in early education, where many of the issues can begin to get addressed in the context of a very supportive environment. So we funded grants in that way last year. We'll make more grants in that fashion this year. We also made grants around healthy relationships and looking at the technology of healthy relationships and how you promote skill sets that allow young people to get better at engaging in healthy relationships. And again, we're looking for people to use scientific methods for getting there, as many of the EBP folks have used to get to the outcomes that your strategies have. And the last one here is we're going to take a really integrated approach to the issues of family homelessness and child welfare. Family homelessness is the fastest growing aspect of all homelessness. And a small percentage of those homeless families are incredibly vulnerable to losing their children to foster care. Many of them already have lost their children to foster care. And so in that initiative, what we're focused on is improving the parents' ability to resist substance abuse. But we're also making in that grant application an opportunity to also spend on getting to better parenting competencies, not parenting classes, and addressing the trauma and emotional distress that the child experiences growing up in a home where substance abuse and bad parenting exist. And so in that grant application, we're packaging all of that stuff together at about $1 million per grant to really help folks begin to think about how they net together a set of evidence-based strategies that address each of those components and areas of functioning in a manner that results in well-being for children in foster care. So again, all carrots, no sticks. The president's budget, he included $250 million annually. Congress has not indicated that they will give the president that money. But were they to give him that money,
All of these dollars would go towards building the capacity of state agencies to offer the right array of evidence-based and evidence-informed strategies for the purposes of getting children and families to well-being. Another carrot. The regional partnership grants have traditionally been used to address issues of substance abuse in the family. We're going to bring substance abuse together with parenting, together with trauma and other mental health interventions, and asking for children who grow up in substance abusing homes, how do you get them to well-being? And again, we're indifferent to whether you do that in the system or in the home. We just want you to be thinking about how do you improve child and family level functioning and what set of interventions support moving in that direction. And then the last two aren't programmatic in nature, but the HHS has established as one of its highest priorities. So in the Secretary's office, they are now saying that addressing issues of trauma in the context of child welfare is an HHS-wide priority. So that brings together Medicaid, CMS, ACYF, ARC, so all of the federal entities, including the National Institute for Mental Health, all sitting around the table trying to say, how do we grow the capacity of child welfare systems to address issues of trauma for children who come into their responsibility. So again, all of those are attempts to think both strategically as well as use all of the science available to take a system that today focuses on safety and permanency and get it to a place where it focuses on safety, permanency, and well-being in an integrated fashion. So that's the goal. And hopefully, I haven't put you all to sleep. And I would welcome questions, concerns, challenges, and anything you'd like to say about what I just spent the last 60 minutes saying to you. So I'm going to shut up. I think we have a couple of mics. And I welcome people's comments or challenges. Thanks. Questions, comments, concerns, ideas?
I just want to say it's wonderful to have someone at your level paying this kind of attention to evidence-based practice, and it's very heartening to many of us who have been advocating for this kind of change, and thank you.
You're welcome.
So 2 questions. One is, I certainly recognized a number of the programs that you had listed there, but I'm wondering if exactly how you define evidence-based practice. So that's number one, because as you know, when funding is in any way attached to something, it becomes a mantra. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I'm wondering about implementation and the evolving science of implementation and how you see things like implementation teams and just all kinds of considerations attached to implementing programs in the correct way and utilizing what we know about that in this whole initiative that you've engaged upon.
So the easy way to describe what I mean by evidence-based practices is blueprints. So the work that we're doing with ABLE is a vehicle for, in part, communicating to folks what we think is the right direction to be going. So that's the easy answer. The larger answer is a little more complicated for this reason. I told you about the 2 major initiatives that the administration is engaged in. The home visiting, I would argue, is using the gold standard of evidence-based, right? So we used a contract in excess of $1 million to do a literature review of all of the known evidence strategies related to home visiting. And when the administration announced the initiative initially, its standard was that it had to be a random control trial. It had to have findings of effectiveness in more than one study. And it also had to have, it had to be able to articulate specifically what populations it had the impact on. So there was this really comprehensive, really gold standard kind of level of expectation about what EBP would be. And it put it out there, and we got crucified. Because folks thought if you set the bar so high that so few programs would ever meet it, then you create a disincentive for folks to focus on getting better. And so we had to re-examine our definition, and in re-examining that definition, we engaged the public, and based on the public's feedback, we established a definition that went from the gold standard, which would have only allowed one EBP in, to a standard that allowed about 8 program strategies in. So the more complicated answer is, this is our definition of EBP, right? Not the gold standard, but a standard that was pretty darn high, and it was one that probably only about 8 made it in. That said, the easier thing to think about in this context, though, is that we're not that initiative. We've sold this argument on child welfare is at the beginning of that journey. We're nowhere near setting the bar so high that we think we can get lots of folks engaged in this work. And so our definition is broad enough to really be inclusive of the work that's reflected in blueprints. Because what we want is more science in child welfare, and we don't want to limit it to just the folks who can have had multiple RCTs done where they can show replicated findings and results for a target population, right? Way too. So what you'll see in almost all of our announcements is evidence-based, evidence-informed, because we want to leave some room there. And if you want more of a definition, I can get you one, but that's the way we'd approach it. Other questions? Yes?
Hi, here's one for you. I second David's appreciation for your remarks, for the position you're in, but I want to challenge you to go back and look at your state of Illinois. For the past year, I've been leading a study that's looking at the rollout of blueprints across states, and of course, yes, that's where the battlefield is.
Yes.
And we look at the leading states, Connecticut, Maine, New Mexico. The best of the states offer more than 10 to 12 teams per million population. We look at Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, less than 1 family-based intervention per million people.
Yes.
Way behind in those states.
Yes.
Those of us who have drunk the Kool-Aid, understand
yes,
this process, how can people still be sitting on their hands 14 years after blueprints came out?
Sure. The easy answer is that I just gave you the reason why. Is because these systems and the fundamental change that happened in 1997 in child welfare was one that said we had to get smaller. And we spent the last 15 years developing the technology of getting smaller. So when that legislation was passed, it did not have all of the solutions that it needed to get smaller. And so you see, from 97 to 2012, this whole range of evolutionary development. So I'll use a couple of examples. In 97, there's no language around guardianship as a strategy to get to permanency. In 97, they did not envision that family members who would take a child into their custody legally but not terminate the rights of the parent to call themselves a parent, they didn't envision using that mechanism in 97. But today we use it, and children leave foster care under guardianship arrangements that weren't envisioned then. We also provide subsidized adoption. So said differently, if you have a child, you're caring for a child, you're getting support from the state for doing that, and you decide to adopt. Today in Illinois, 99% of children who get adopted leave foster care with the same payment leaving with them that they had while they were in foster care, not anticipated. So for example, in Illinois, the argument would be they spend $300 million a year on children who are no longer in foster care because they left through adoption and guardianship. But we decided that spending $300 million to get them to a permanent family was more important than saving the money in the long term. So when you look at systems, and Illinois is a classic example, the focus has been on safety and permanency, and we've developed a bunch of innovative strategies to get there. So as we stand here today, most states aren't focused on EBPs because no child welfare director loses their job because a child doesn't function better. When do they lose their job? When a kid dies or when their population grows? And so there's no current incentive for states to move beyond meeting those basic obligations of safety and permanency. And they got better at permanency over time. And so what I've said to folks is, it took us 15 years to get to permanency. It's going to take us 15 years to get to well-being. And we got to start somewhere and start the ball rolling. So in Illinois, great example. What did we do around EBPs? We took a trauma-focused approach. I was only there for 4 years, not forever. But we did the research to come to the conclusion that trauma was a better intervention than most of the interventions we were using. We developed a curriculum that was targeted to foster parents and frontline workers. We implemented both of those things. We also identified 3 evidence-based practices at the time, and we funded those in all 6 of the regions. So every region got introduced to EBPs through 3 strategies. One that focused on the little ones, one that focused on the middle ones, and one that focused on the older ones. And we focused on fidelity to implementation. That was the lion's share of the work that I did. You also take the screening tool that I described earlier, that we have that rich data from. That was also something we did. So if you take the screening instrument alone, to be able to do that for every kid in foster care in the first 45 days of entering foster care, it cost me $24 million. Totally the right investment, but it cost me $24 million to get there. The EBPs, to try to do those in every region, 3 categories, cost me another 10. So I was at 24 million. I was at 24 plus 10. I was at 34 million. In the last 2 years of trying to get this going in the right direction. So, yes, there are a lot of places. I share your frustration. But I also are trying to take that frustration and turn it into something that moves the field in the right way. And so I've been trying to have a conversation about evidence-based practice for the entire time I've been here. But it's only after being able to articulate what I articulated in the last hour that we've gotten any movement. Now Congress is talking about evidence-based in the context of child welfare. At the end of the month, Congress is going to have a hearing on well-being for kids in foster care, right? And you've got an administration that said we don't have new money, but they stood up and put $250 million into a budget, where everybody else in the place that I come from, ACF, almost everybody else took a cut. We didn't take a cut. They proposed $250 million more, and they proposed it specifically to put more evidence-based strategies into the child welfare system. So I hear your frustration. I share it. I spent the last 3 years trying to move Washington to see how important this issue is, and we're finally starting to see movement. And again, I'm trying to use a carrot. So everything that we're doing around funding, we're doing it with a focus on evidence-based practice. Thanks. Yes? Oh. I think there's a mic back there, and then this woman would love to have a mic next, sir. Yes?
Hi, I'm Bob Slavin from Johns Hopkins University and work in education. I'm sure you're aware of the I3 grants in education, which are working in a very different way. I guess I wonder how you think about the differences between how HHS is approaching evidence-based reform and how I3 is approaching evidence-based reform. I3 is focusing on trying to build up the set of proven programs, paying for development and evaluation of programs, but doing very little on the consumer side. And HHS is doing a lot, I think, on the consumer side, trying to build a taste for evidence-based reform out in the world at large and in government itself.
Sure.
I just wondered if you could comment on that and also on links between the work that you're doing with HHS and education per se, because, of course, kids who succeed in school are also less likely to be involved in violence and other problems.
Yes. Let me start by disclosing that I told you I spent 2.5 years as the chief of staff at the Chicago Public Schools. I spent that time as Secretary Duncan's chief of staff. So the guy over at the Department of Ed today running it is a really good friend of mine, and we work in a very coordinated fashion. That said, the biggest difference between us and education is the $2 or $3 billion in new money that was invested in Race to the Top, right? So it's the single most important domestic investment that the president would articulate after health care. And so in many respects, they've been able to just use those piles of money to bring people to innovation. They didn't have to engage consumers because they thought that if they just raised that carrot up high enough, folks would chase that carrot in a manner that would change their behavior. I don't have the ability to do that. I don't have the $250 million I talked about. I don't have anything close to $1 billion. So a big part of what we have focused on is bringing the field here because I had enough money to do that. And when you look at the investments that we're making, those aren't new dollars. Those are dollars that Congress always provides to me to provide services for children in foster care. But those are discretionary pots that have already been built into them. So there's no new funding here. The funding and the strategies we're using are opportunistic. And that's just the reality of the economic circumstances that we're in. So education's been able to take an approach that's different than ours because they've had a lot more money, and understandably so. It's a priority for the president. It's the right priority. I don't lose any sleep at night knowing that they're putting a very large investment in public education. And so the grants that I described earlier around early childhood and for older youth, we did in conjunction with the Department of Ed to make sure that we've got it right. We also, in partnership with the Department of Ed last summer, did a summit where we brought together all of the child welfare directors and all the state superintendents together in one place to talk about how we get to better educational outcomes for kids in foster care. And so that group spent 2 days together really strategizing at the state level about how they were going to do this and about how they learn from one another. And so we'll continue to support the work that's being done under the summit, as well as continue to make those discretionary investments that give states additional planning dollars to partner with education to build bigger strategies. But I got to tell you, honestly, child welfare can build bridges to education without any new money. I'll give you 2 examples. One is a child welfare director in any one of these states could stand up and say this: for every 3 to 5-year-old child who enters foster care, we require that they be enrolled in early education. Because children in foster care, from a federal standpoint, are priorities for early education funding and for Head Starts. And the reason why I know they could do that is because that's what I did. And today, 90% of kids in Illinois who are 3 to 5-year-old and in out-of-home care are in the early education program. We also adopted a strategy that said that we wanted to stop placing children based on where the homes were, and we wanted to start placing children based on where their school was. So we created the placement, we changed the placement process so that whenever a child was entering out-of-home care, as soon as we knew the address, we knew the school boundaries. And as soon as we knew the school boundaries, we knew all the foster homes that we had in those boundaries. We first wanted to place with a relative, so we would use that as option A. But if we did that, we provided transportation support so that relative could keep the kid in the school that they were already in. If we weren't going to give them to a relative and we were going to place them in a foster home, we started with, are there any foster homes in the area? And if there are, we placed there first. And by doing that, we reduced the distance that a child was placed when they entered foster care from 20 miles to 8 miles. Again, those were steps we took. Any state child welfare director could take those steps today. It wouldn't cost them a whole lot. But I think in order to get them to take that step, they got to see the benefit to an early education experience. And it's not because early education is going to make them more likely to reach permanency. The early education experience is going to increase the likelihood that they succeed in life regardless of whether they achieve permanency or not. So for me, shifting the focus to well-being is about trying to get people to appreciate the lifetime effect of maltreatment and anticipate from day one that maltreatment is the primary focus. Work on safety and permanency, but at the same time, get at issues of well-being. And I gave you 2 examples of where states could do that without losing any of the focus on getting a child to a permanent home. So, that's the other message here is, yeah, we need more money, but we also just need people to recognize that there's stuff here we can do, and we can do it within the existing resources. We're going to communicate the same thing about EBPs. So in many of our announcements, we say to folks, we don't want you just to go find EBPs. We want you to use our money to go find evidence-based strategies that you can use to replace the programs that you're already purchasing, and use our money as the difference maker between purchasing services as usual to services that have an evidence base to them. So we're not trying to say, let's just add more to the continuum. We're saying a lot of what's in the continuum doesn't work. Let's strategically start taking some of those components out of the continuum and replace them with EBPs. So use the same money that you were using on ineffective programs to do evidence-based practice and use our money as the difference to get you to being able to afford an evidence-based practice. I think we can take probably one more question or 2 more. Here.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Sophine Charles from the Council of Family and Child Caring Agencies out of New York State. I've heard you talk about well-being, trauma, and permanency. Very often when we think about evidence-based treatment and the practices, we hear violence prevention, crime reduction, and speaking to incarceration rates. I haven't heard you mention any of those words, and I'm wondering if you could say something about that. And the other piece is workforce development for many of the agencies. What types of considerations are given to developing the casework staff for supporting and sustaining evidence-based practices? Many of our agencies are struggling with trying to develop the workforce in order to do the work. If you could speak to that.
Great question. So I'll start with the first question around the language that I use here. Everybody in the room here didn't get into this business to make the child welfare system smaller. We all got in this business to make kids and families better off. I haven't met a juvenile justice program that makes a kid better off. We ran at the Chicago Public Schools. We ran a school in the detention center, and so every day, young people who were locked up spent 8 hours a day in a school that sat within a juvenile detention center. And when you look at the challenges that those young people have, they can be defined by two characteristics. Really low educational capacity. The average kid entering a detention center in Cook County was 16-year-old on average and had accumulated 5 credits. So they have major academic deficits, and they have been exposed to lots of violence. And there's nothing in the correctional experience that addresses either of those. And so we've been working with DOJ around issues of well-being and trauma and evidence-based practice so that we're talking about it the same way they're talking about it. So DOJ has had their Defending Childhood initiative that really focuses on children exposed to violence and intervening effectively. We did the same evidence review with them so that when we looked at and talked about issues of exposure to violence and evidence-based practice, we talked about it the same way, we used the same criteria, we identified the same programs. Because again, my earlier slide showed that most of the kids that end up in the juvenile justice system have very similar levels of maltreatment as the kids who don't. And so we've been trying to be at the table every day saying, let's do this together. And there's a lot of instinct. There are lots of folks that carry badges and guns that hear what I have to say and think, that's that touchy-feely stuff, right? But, I stand up in front of them all the time and give them the same speech. And, they don't all buy it, but increasingly more are. So I stood up in front of a bunch of badges and guns last week and gave a presentation. It was 10 slides, and it was all about the impact of maltreatment on relationships and talking about how when they look at the young people that they're working with, they ought to understand that work in the context of relationships. 2 things happen. 1, standing ovation. Wow, scary. But 2, folks like the D.C. Department of Policing emailed immediately, we want a meeting because we want to restructure all of the non-justice resources around issues of well-being and addressing capacity to have supportive, healthy relationships with adults and peers. So spend enough time making the right argument and helping people see that there's another path to getting these kids to better outcomes than the juvenile correction system. We think we're building some momentum, but it means doing this. So I'm going to close by saying this. I don't have the capacity to be in every room like this around America every time these discussions are happening. And so the reason why I asked for 90 minutes and the reason why I was glad to come here and spend the day with you is because I think that everybody in this room has the capacity to articulate some part of the argument that I just made. And so this is literally a campaign to help people understand that the goal in all of our work with young people ought to be around the goal of well-being. And that the interventions that we're choosing ought to be around specific domains and about promoting healthy development, moving children who aren't in the normal areas or trajectory of development, moving them from that abnormal environment back into a normal area of development, increasing their capacity to succeed, not in the absence of the bad stuff happening to them, but in the context of the bad stuff happening to them. We can no longer deny the consequences of maltreatment on adult outcomes. And so our strategies ought to be in the face of those consequences and not in the absence of them. And so I really encourage you to take some part of this message back to your part of the world and say, there's more we can do with what we have. And there's more we can do with the commitments of the other folks in our community. This is a campaign. We need everybody out there articulating a message that's really important. This is change that's not going to happen overnight. But if I could get 400 people in this room to go back to their communities and talk about the importance of well-being in the context of young people who are struggling in school, struggling in the juvenile justice system, and struggling in child welfare, because all these kids need the same thing. They need adults to recognize that the impact of maltreatment is profound, and the work of getting to better outcomes is dealing with that maltreatment, not running from it. So thanks, and enjoy the rest of the conference.